All right, listen up, you magnificent history buffs and connoisseurs of the bizarre. Welcome to the show where we ditch the dusty textbooks and dive headfirst into the scandalous secrets that your high school teachers were way too scared to tell you. Today, we're tackling a topic that's whispered in history books and sensationalized in bad romance novels. Royal nymphomaniacs, inside the forbidden banquets of the court. Yeah, you heard that right. We're not talking polite tea parties and awkward arranged marriages. We're talking about the no-holds-barred, behind-closed-doors shenanigans of the ruling class. The kind of stuff that would make even the most depraved reality TV show look like a Disney flick. Smash that like button right now if you've ever wondered what really went on in those opulent palaces. Because trust me, the truth is way wilder than any conspiracy theory you've ever stumbled across on the internet. Now, before your imagination runs completely rampant with images of velvet-clad orgies, though spoiler alert, there's definitely some of that coming. Let's set the stage. We're not just talking about a few frisky monarchs sneaking around with the stable boy. Though again, that happened more than you'd think. We're plunging into a world where power, privilege, and a severe lack of anything productive to do led to some truly innovative uses of the royal anatomy. Think of it like this. Imagine being born into a life where you literally have everything. Anything you desire is yours for the taking. You have armies at your command, unimaginable wealth, and a lineage that stretches back centuries. What do you do for kicks? Well, after you've collected enough priceless artifacts and thrown enough lavish parties to make Jay Gatsby blush, human nature tends to find other avenues for entertainment. And when you're a royal, the usual rules don't exactly apply. There's no HR department to file a complaint with when the king decides your spouse has interesting qualities. Hold up, did I just say spouse? Because here's the first little nugget of historical truth to chew on. Love and marriage in royal circles were about as genuine as a $3 bill. It was all about alliances, land grabs, and pumping out heirs. So what happens when you're stuck in a politically motivated marriage with someone about as exciting as watching paint dry? You start looking for a little extracurricular activity, and when you're the most powerful person in the land, a little can quickly escalate into something that would make Caligula blush. We're not going to name names just yet. We like to build a little suspense around here. But trust me, the historical figures we'll be discussing took the concept of living like royalty to a whole new, incredibly salacious level. Forget the carefully curated image of dignified rulers. We're peeling back the layers of silk and ermine to reveal the messy, complicated, and often downright bizarre realities of royal desire. So, buckle up, folks. We're going on a journey into the forbidden corners of royal history, where the only thing more rampant than the gossip was, well, you know. Let me know in the comments right now. What's the wildest rumor you've ever heard about royal misbehavior? Don't be shy, we're all friends here. And trust me, the reality is going to be even crazier. Now, if you thought the whole royalty for land and power thing sounded depressing, you're about to meet a woman who basically said, "Hold my borscht." We're talking about Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, a ruler so powerful and so unapologetically in charge of her own life that she makes every CEO from a prestige TV show look like a total amateur. Let's be real. She didn't just smash the glass ceiling. She built an entire palace out of its shattered remains and then threw a party in it. Born a minor German princess, Catherine was shipped off to Russia to marry a man who was, to put it mildly, a hot mess. Seriously, her husband, Peter III, was a child in a man's body, obsessed with playing with toy soldiers and generally acting like a medieval version of a trust fund kid who peaked in middle school. As he floundered on the throne, Catherine was doing what any ambitious, smart person would do. She was networking, building alliances, and getting a PhD in Russian politics. When the time was right, she staged a coup with the help of her lover and a bunch of loyal guards, had Peter removed, and declared herself empress. It was a move so savage and so brilliant, it's the kind of plot twist M. Night Shyamalan would kill for. But here's where our story takes a hard left turn, right into the palace chambers. Once Catherine secured the throne, she was free. Free from her deadbeat husband, free from the constraints of European morality, and free to basically live her best life. You see, Catherine wasn't just a political genius, she had an appetite for companionship. Her court became a revolving door of powerful men known as her favorites. No, this wasn't just some secret tryst in a closet. This was a formal, institutionalized system. Think of it like an elaborate, high-stakes version of The Bachelor, but instead of a rose, the winner got a title, a mansion, and a whole lot of power. And unlike those reality TV shows, the competition was fierce and the stakes were real. When Catherine's eye landed on you, it was a massive upgrade to your life. You moved into the palace, got a huge salary, and were given lavish gifts. Some of these guys were legitimate military heroes or political minds who she relied on for advice. Others? Well, let's just say their main qualification was not their skill in diplomacy. And this is where the gossip machine really starts to hum. While Peter the Great's court was known for its crude, drunken revelry, Catherine's was a masterclass in controlled, sensual opulence. These were not just dinners. They were meticulously planned affairs, designed to impress and to, shall we say, set a mood. We're talking about banquets with gold-plated silverware, rivers of champagne, and entertainment that went way beyond a string quartet. The food was brought in from all corners of the vast Russian Empire, a display of power and excess. But what happened after the dessert was served? That's where the real forbidden part comes in. The men who were her favorites were given unprecedented access and power, but they were also bound by her will. And when a favorite fell out of favor, the consequences were swift and total. He wasn't just given a first-class ticket home. He was often banished, his power stripped away as quickly as it was granted. Real talk, this wasn't just about pleasure, it was about power. By constantly cycling through her favorites, Catherine kept anyone from getting too much influence. It was a brilliant and frankly ruthless way to consolidate her control over the Russian aristocracy. She used desire as a political weapon, a strategy that few rulers, male or female, have ever mastered to this degree. It was a game she played, a chessboard where the pieces were made of flesh and blood. And get this, there was even a position known as the bed warmer, a trusted friend of the Empress who would, yes, literally sleep in the bed before the new favorite. Think of it as a quality control check. You can't make this stuff up, guys. So, while the rest of Europe was pretending to be all prim and proper, Catherine was building an empire on the back of her own ambition and her, shall we say, robust personal life. But what about the parties themselves? The things that were too scandalous for the history books? We'll get to those, but first, let me know in the comments. If you were a monarch, what's the first over-the-top, totally unhinged thing you'd do with your power? Be honest. All right, so we've established that Catherine wasn't just a one-man show. Her court was a finely tuned machine of power and pleasure, and the engine room of that machine was the royal banquet. Now forget everything you think you know about a fancy dinner party with a few too many glasses of wine. The banquets at Catherine's court were less like a staid state dinner and more like a live-action version of a secret society meeting, where the currency wasn't money, it was favor and desire. You step into the Winter Palace. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive perfume. The long tables are not just set. They're groaning under the weight of silver, crystal, and food from every corner of the empire she controls. We're talking roasted sturgeon from the Caspian Sea, fine French pastries, and a seemingly endless flow of imported champagne and vodka. It's a literal feast for the senses, designed to overwhelm and to remind everyone in the room who exactly is in charge. It's the ultimate flex. And it wasn't just the food. The entertainment was on another level. Live orchestras, theatrical performances, lavish masquerade balls, where the masks weren't just a fun accessory, but a way to get into some serious trouble without anyone knowing. It was at these banquets that Catherine truly held court. Observing and orchestrating everything from her place at the head of the table, she could make or break a career with a single flirtatious glance. This is where the term forbidden gets real. Because while these events were ostensibly public, the inner circle was a world unto itself. The most powerful men in Russia were jockeying for her attention, competing for the honor of being her next favorite, knowing that one wrong move could land them in a Siberian prison. The whispers, the secret glances, the coded messages passed over gilded platters of caviar, that was the real meal. It was a banquet of intrigue, and Catherine was the head chef. Here's where it gets juicy. There's a story, a historical rumor whispered in the archives, about a specific kind of test for her potential favorites. It was a kind of a royal performance review. A man, often a young, promising military officer, would be invited to a private dinner with a small, trusted group. As the night wore on, the test would begin. This wasn't a standardized exam with multiple-choice questions. This was a show of wit, charm, and, yes, stamina. She would push their limits, intellectually and personally, to see how they would react under pressure, surrounded by her hand-picked observers. It was an audition for the most powerful and dangerous role in the empire. It's almost like the ultimate high-stakes version of those dating shows, where the contestants are put through crazy challenges. Except here, the grand prize wasn't a rose, it was an empire. Pause the video right now and let me know in the comments. Do you think Catherine's use of her favorites was a sign of empowerment, or was she just as trapped by the system as the men who served her? And this game of power and seduction wasn't unique to Russia. It was a silent shadow war waged in courts all over the world. From the lavish halls of Versailles to the opulent palaces of the Ottoman Empire, rulers understood that the path to a man's loyalty often ran directly through. Well, you get the idea. But while Catherine was a master of the open court, the French, as always, preferred to take their debauchery to a whole new level of elegance and excess. And that, my friends, is exactly where we're headed next. All right, we've just left Catherine the Great, a ruler who masterfully weaponized desire to consolidate power. Now we're going to hop on a private jet and fly right over to the court of France, to a place where the phrase, "let them eat cake," was just the start of the problem. We're talking about King Louis XV. If Catherine was the strategic boss, Louis was the spoiled trust fund kid who inherited the company and then blew it all on private parties. He was known as Louis the Beloved early on, which, you'll see, is a title about as accurate as calling a cat a dog. Louis XV inherited the throne from his great-grandfather, the legendary Sun King, Louis XIV, who basically invented the whole concept of over-the-top royal extravagance at Versailles. But while Louis XIV used Versailles to control his nobles, Louis XV used it as his public-facing office and saved the real fun for a much more intimate setting. And that, my friends, is where we find the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, or Deer Park. Now, you've probably heard this name whispered in history class or on some documentary, but the reality is so much more messed up. The Parc aux Cerfs wasn't a public park or a hunting ground. It was a secret, unassuming house located just outside the Versailles grounds, a place where the king could escape the suffocating protocol of court life and live out his private fantasies. It was his personal clubhouse, his Vegas suite, and his secret lair all rolled into one, and it was filled with young women who were brought there for one purpose only: his pleasure. Unlike Catherine, who elevated her lovers to positions of power, Louis XV's liaisons were not about politics. They were pure, unadulterated indulgence, a symptom of a monarch who was completely checked out from the well-being of his kingdom. He was bored, he was lonely, and he was a king. So he had the entire force of the French state at his disposal to satisfy his desires. The women brought to the Parc aux Cerfs were not powerful courtiers. They were often young, from humble backgrounds, and had no real power or protection. It's the kind of story that would be a shocking exposé today, a scandal on the level of a Hollywood A-lister's secret commune. The banquets at this little house were nothing like the grand public spectacles of Catherine's court. They were quiet, intimate affairs. Think secret dinners with a few trusted friends and a rotating cast of young women. There was no political intrigue here, just the king indulging his private appetites, far away from the judgmental eyes of the court and the public. These were the true forbidden banquets, not because they were filled with wild, open orgies, but because their existence was a total secret, a clandestine world built on the abuse of power and privilege. And this is where things get really wild. While the king was off in his secret hideaway, the French public was starving. There were food riots in the streets. People were losing their homes. And the disconnect between the royal lifestyle and the reality of the people was growing wider by the day. Louis XV's private life was a dark, festering secret that, when it eventually became public knowledge, would ignite the kind of fury that a guillotine was made for. And believe me, the people were furious. Rumors of the Parc aux Cerfs spread like wildfire, painting a picture of a king who was not just a poor ruler, but a moral degenerate. But what did the most powerful mistress in French history have to say about all this? The woman who held the king's heart for over 2 decades and was, arguably, one of the real minds behind the throne. You know I'm talking about Madame de Pompadour. Hold up, before we get into that, drop a comment below if you think a king's private life should be a matter of public scrutiny, or if what he does behind closed doors is his own business. I want to hear what you guys think, because this next part changes everything we know about power, scandal, and the role of the mistress. So, as we were just saying, while King Louis XV was off at his little private party house, there was one woman at Versailles who was playing a completely different game. A game of pure, unadulterated power. I'm talking about Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, who you know better as Madame de Pompadour. Let me be clear, she was not just a mistress, she was a legend, a commoner who became the unofficial Queen of France, and held more power than most of the nobles who looked down their noses at her. And here's the most unbelievable part. Her influence on Louis XV didn't end when their physical relationship did. After a decade as his official mistress, they transitioned into what was basically a best friends with immense benefits situation. She became his most trusted political advisor, his confidant, and the person he relied on to run the social and cultural life of the court. She basically went from being a love interest to the world's most powerful chief of staff, and she did it all while the entire country hated her guts. The public absolutely despised her. They saw her as a social climber, a gold digger, and the reason the king was so detached from his people. The rumors were insane, painting her as some kind of insatiable demon who was single-handedly bankrupting the nation with her extravagant parties and patronage of the arts. But here's a little historical real talk for you. The king's wars and poor financial decisions did more damage to the French treasury than any of her salons or theatrical performances ever did. The blame was just easier to place on the woman who dared to hold power. This is where her story intersects with our theme of forbidden banquets in a totally different way. She didn't participate in the secret parties at the Parc aux Cerfs. In fact, she was often seen as the one who managed the king's other relationships, but her power was in the events she did control. Her salons were the real forbidden banquets of Versailles, where she, a commoner, sat at the center of the French universe. Here she cultivated the brightest minds of the era, philosophers, artists, writers, and used her influence to shape public opinion and political policy. This wasn't just a social club. It was a power lunch that never ended. She curated guest lists like a VIP nightclub bouncer, deciding who got access to the king and who was cast out into the social wilderness. The most exclusive invitation in all of Europe wasn't to a state dinner. It was to one of Madame de Pompadour's private gatherings. If you were on her good side, you could get a minister fired. If you weren't, you were basically a ghost at court. It was a completely new and completely feminine way of wielding power. She basically created her own brand of influence, turning her position as a mistress into a political office. She knew that Louis was a king who preferred pleasure over policy, so she made sure that she was the most pleasurable, most stimulating, and most indispensable part of his life, both in and out of the bedroom. She wasn't a victim of the system. She was a master of it, playing the game with a level of skill that would make any modern-day political lobbyist look like a rookie. If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most insane plot twist in history. Because while Catherine used her favorites to secure her throne, and Louis used his mistresses to escape his, there was a whole other kind of royal excess happening across the globe. One that didn't just involve people, but involved some truly bizarre rituals that would make the most twisted movie scenes look like child's play. This next story is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. We're leaving the palaces of Europe behind and heading to a completely different court, where the forbidden banquets were less about power and more about a dark, macabre form of spectacle. Get ready, because you're not going to believe what happened here. All right, buckle up, Buttercup, because we're taking a hard turn. If Catherine the Great's court was a high-stakes chess game and Louis XIV's was a secret club for the king, then our next destination is less a court and more a psychological thriller written by a deranged genius. We're leaving the silks and powdered wigs of Europe behind and heading back to ancient Rome, to the reign of an emperor who was basically a living, breathing meme of absolute power gone completely bonkers. I'm talking about a teenage emperor named Heliogabalus. Let me be clear, this guy makes Caligula look like a responsible adult. Heliogabalus came to power at the ripe old age of 14 and spent his short 4-year reign completely dismantling every single tradition and social norm of the Roman Empire, all for a bit of a laugh and a whole lot of debauchery. He was less a ruler and more a performance artist with an army. And his forbidden banquets. Oh, folks, these were not just meals. They were theatrical productions designed to shock, confuse, and terrorize his guests. We're talking about a dinner where the food was so elaborate it was literally impossible to eat. Imagine this. You sit down at a banquet with the emperor. The first course is served, and it's something totally exotic like the brains of 1,000 birds or a dish made entirely of flamingo tongues. It's a display of wealth, but also a sign that this dude is unhinged, and you have to pretend it's delicious, but that's just the appetizer. One night, Heliogabalus invited his most powerful nobles to a dinner party. They sat down at their elaborate couches, ready for a feast, only to find that the cushions were secretly filled with air. As they reclined, the air was slowly let out, causing the cushions to deflate, and all of them were left sprawling on the floor, looking completely ridiculous, while the emperor just sat there laughing his head off. This was his idea of a good time. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about power through humiliation. He was a teenager with the ultimate troll account, and you were all of his followers. And get this, there are historical accounts that claim he would sometimes release bears, lions, and leopards into the dining room during these banquets, all of the animals having been completely defanged and declawed. It was a macabre spectacle, a mix of genuine terror and forced laughter. Everyone had to pretend they were having the time of their lives, while in their minds they were probably writing their last will and testament. Heliogabalus's reign was a constant public-facing assault on the concept of decency. He would dress in women's clothing, wear so much makeup he looked like a clown, and essentially declare himself a high priest of a foreign sun god, forcing everyone to worship with him. His sexuality was as fluid and wild as his parties. He would marry men and women, often having them executed shortly after. It was all about shocking the system, turning every Roman tradition on its head just because he could. This wasn't just a matter of private scandalous behavior like Louis XV. This was a public display of pure chaotic power. A king who had so much authority, he didn't even have to hide his madness. He was using these forbidden banquets not to build alliances, not to find pleasure, but to demonstrate that he was above all of them, that he could do anything, and no one could stop him. This total disregard for order, this pure narcissistic chaos, is what separates him from every other royal we've talked about so far. If you're still with me right now, you need to hit that like button, because this is just a fraction of the insanity. But while Heliogabalus's reign ended in a bloody and very public way, it left us with a key piece of the puzzle. It shows us that royal debauchery isn't just about sex or power. Sometimes it's about a total, unhinged breakdown of reality. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, a story that weaves all of these threads together: power, pleasure, and the ultimate forbidden secret. All right, so we've seen the political genius of Catherine, the quiet indulgence of Louis, and the chaotic insanity of Heliogabalus. But what if there was a single royal court that took all those vibes, put them in a blender, and added a heaping tablespoon of theatricality and pure, unadulterated swagger? To find that, we got to jump over to England, to a guy who earned the nickname the Merry Monarch for a reason. I'm talking about King Charles II. Now, to understand Charles's court, you got to get the context. Before he took the throne, England had been run by a bunch of Puritans led by Oliver Cromwell. These guys were basically the historical equivalent of a really strict school principal. No fun, no theatre, no drinking, no colourful clothes. Everything was grey, boring, and frankly, a total buzzkill. When Cromwell died and Charles II was restored to the throne, the entire nation basically let out a collective scream and said, "We are partying now." And party they did. Charles II's court became the epicenter of the Restoration, a cultural pendulum swing so massive it's almost unbelievable. The arts, theatre, and science exploded, and so did the social scene. Charles himself was a total charmer, a witty, sophisticated king who loved women, gambling, and a good time. He wasn't a military conqueror or a political mastermind on the level of Catherine, but he was a master of public relations, using his personal charm and his court's hedonism to project an image of power and stability after years of civil war. His forbidden banquets were legendary, but they were different from the others we've discussed. They weren't secretive like Louis's, and they weren't designed to terrify like Heliogabalus's. They were a celebration, a public display of decadence and libertine values. Think opulent dinners with poets, playwrights, and painters, where the conversation was as spirited and often as scandalous as the company. The king's mistresses were not hidden away. They were celebrated, given titles, and sat right there at the dinner table. This was a direct, public middle finger to the Puritans who had tried to ban fun entirely. And this is where our favorite royal mistress of all time comes in, Nell Gwyn. She was an actress, a woman from the streets of London who caught the king's eye. Unlike Madame de Pompadour, who had to fight for her place in court, Nell Gwyn was a popular figure, a beloved symbol of the Restoration's free spirit. She was a commoner who became the king's favourite, not through political manoeuvring, but through her wit, her charm, and her open, vibrant personality. Their relationship was a public scandal, but one that the public absolutely loved. She was basically the OG celebrity influencer, and the whole nation was following her. Her presence at court, a former orange seller turned royal mistress, shows how much the world had changed. The banquets and parties weren't just for nobles anymore, they were for anyone who could make the king laugh. It was a new kind of power, a new kind of rebellion, where the social hierarchy was challenged by wit and charisma. It was messy, it was loud, and it was a whole lot of fun. But of course, this kind of excess never comes without a price. While Charles was having the time of his life, his reign was also marked by two of the biggest disasters in English history, the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. And even though his court was the picture of scandalous joy, there were still political and religious factions constantly plotting against him, a brewing storm that would threaten to tear the kingdom apart once again. This is the ultimate paradox of royal debauchery. It's a mirror, a reflection of the court, the nation, and the ruler themselves. Sometimes it's about control, sometimes it's about escape, and sometimes it's just about being completely unhinged. But in the end, it always has consequences. In the next part, we're going to pull all these threads together and finally answer the ultimate question. What was the real story behind these forbidden banquets, and what lessons can they teach us about power, desire, and the dark side of history? All right, folks, we've come a long way. We've traveled from the icy palaces of Russia to the gilded halls of Versailles, all the way back to the chaotic, blood-soaked arenas of ancient Rome, and then to the rowdy courts of England. We've seen rulers who were masters of desire and rulers who were its complete slaves. We've seen secrets, spectacles, and utter madness. But now it's time to pull all these twisted threads together and finally answer the question that brought us here in the first place. What were the forbidden banquets really about? And the answer, my friends, is that they weren't about one thing. They were a funhouse mirror reflecting the deep, dark truth of absolute power. For Catherine the Great, the forbidden banquets were a tool. She used desire as a political weapon, a way to test loyalty and to keep her rivals off balance. Her story shows us that when a ruler is smart enough, they can turn their own appetites into a way to secure their legacy. It wasn't just about having fun. It was about running a goddamn empire. For Louis XV, they were an escape. The Parc aux Cerfs wasn't about power. It was about running from the crushing weight of it. It shows us what happens when a ruler has everything but wants for nothing. They create a secret world just to feel something, anything, even if that feeling is a moral and social vacuum. And in the end, that vacuum ate his kingdom alive. For Heliogabalus, the banquets were a declaration. They were an unhinged scream into the void of Roman tradition, a way to prove that his power was so absolute he didn't even have to pretend to be a decent human being. His story is a warning, a cautionary tale that pure, unadulterated nihilism is a one-way ticket to a very short and bloody reign. It's the ultimate example of what happens when the only rule is, there are no rules. And for King Charles II, they were an act of defiance. His court's hedonism was a middle finger to the past, a loud public party that said, we're free now, and we're going to enjoy it. His story shows us that sometimes royal excess can be a symptom of a cultural shift, a reflection of a society finally letting go of its chains and celebrating its own freedom. So, when you hear about royal nymphomaniacs and forbidden banquets, don't just think about the salacious stuff. Think about the power. Think about the control. Think about the humanity, and sometimes the total lack of it, that lay beneath the crowns and the velvet robes. The real forbidden part wasn't the desire itself. It was the fact that a select few people in history had so much power that no one could tell them no. This is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. There are so many more stories like these, hidden in the dusty corners of history, that school will never teach you. But the only way we can unearth them is if you stick around. What do you think? Which royal was the most insane? Was it Catherine the Great, Louis XV, or Heliogabalus? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to keep diving into the kind of history that makes Netflix documentaries look boring, make sure you hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and join our little community of history weirdos. Thanks for watching, everyone.